On. Okay, we're live. Tom, if you want to start us off.
Well, in this call we will talk about how American policies and ways of thought and ideals are influencing India and how India is dealing with it. At the turn of the 21st century.
So why why
Um,
why did you select this topic, suggest this topic?
well, I mean, if we look out, outside, in any day in any place in India, the one thing which you can find influencing us is definitely the United States. I mean, politically or culturally, we may have different relationships, which may be or may not be very strong. But one thing you can see is that at a general public level, people are more strongly influenced by the United States, especially whenever it comes to Hollywood, about the freedom of speech, the television, or watching news, or at least not in sports, but in everything else. We are most influenced by United States. I think I can think of a couple of reasons why. One is both are democracies, both have a lineage of getting independence from the British Empire, so we have a natural affinity towards each other. And uh, and the other reason is, I think, the American ideals are very attractive and rather seductive. The freedom, the liberalism, the individuality, the focus on growth and progress and prosperity, happiness. I mean, these are very, very attractive ideals. So I can see why Indians are also gravitated towards that. But when you say rubber meets the road, and I mean, India also has a different uh, past and a different cultural heritage. So when we try to marry that American ideal with the Indian reality, that's where a lot of discussions and debates and adjustments happen.
Right. So yeah, I really liked this topic because it's been kind of on my mind too, as I've seen a lot of the debates erupt in the Indian online space. Um, there's been a lot of discussion of American ideas, like I said, freedom of speech being one of the big ones, secularism. But what I've largely seen is this attempt by a lot of people to transpose American models of or American historical context into the Indian condition. And I feel that's completely dysfunctional at the best of times, because while there are some similarities, um, say between like caste and the oppression of Black people, there are so many differences that those similarities are largely inconsequential. But American academia, being what it is, has kind of oversimplified everything into these little narrative sound bites, right? Like oppressor versus oppressed. Uh, you know, you have the white man's burden, civilizing the savage, all of these little bite-sized narrative things, and they've essentially taken it and transposed it into the Indian context. For example, I've heard a lot of Indian Americans and a lot of academics who are familiar with the Indic studies, refer to Brahmins as white adjacent, which is about as nonsensical as you can really get, um, especially given that the condition of Brahmins inside India is radically different from whites in the US, who are the majority, whereas Brahmins in India are like, I want to say like less than 10% of the actual population, something like that. It's something ridiculously small number.
3%.
Was that
3%.
3%?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's
It's
a lot
only
small.
UP that Brahmins make up 10%.
Wow.
Everywhere else, it's less than 10.
I did not realize it was that small. Okay. I mean, this is what I mean, though. It's very much of an issue where the American and Western historical experience has been essentially superimposed on everyone else's historical experience, and we're all required to interpret our experiences present day based on their understanding of their history, right? Which is a ridiculous ask of anyone.
Well, a lot of this also has to do with Isabel Wilkerson's book, recent book that came out on caste, and using caste as an analogy or a comparative framework to understand race in America. So there's actually a written fairly, it's a very popular book, and anyone who's read that book here thinks that they know something about caste in India also, which is kind of irritating at times. And one thing that I pointed out, although one thing that she does get right in a few things she gets right, but as an aside, I'll say, I was teaching just the other day about how Gandhi he sort of had internalized this caste or like racial hierarchies, because his attitude towards Africans in South Africa was largely in agreement. He was kind of in agreement with the whites essentially. There's actually a lot of work on this now. And there was recent movement in South Africa to actually, I don't know if it was South Africa or one of the other African countries, where there was a movement to actually get his statue down, um, uh, because he was seen as someone who was furthering colonial narratives about Africans. So there has been always a sliver of the Brahmin population that has seen itself as white adjacent, because like we are, but it doesn't necessarily pan out look like on the ground. To that end, I think you're right. That but there are plenty of people who do see themselves as like, yeah. I mean, so we are. I mean, I know people who are from Brahmin communities, not very dissimilar from ours, who have internalized this idea that, yeah, we are white adjacent, and why shouldn't we be called as white adjacent? They live abroad. By abroad, I mean they live largely outside India. Some probably do live in India as well. So, but the fact is, the ground reality, the socio-economic, the cultural reality of that statement is contested at best.
It's incredibly loaded. Yeah.
And the second thing I'll add to this whole thing, and when I teach my students about liberalism, and I tell them, when we talk about liberal internationalism, we don't mean party ID in the US in the traditional sense. Essentially, if you could imagine a standardized, like a normal distribution bell curve, forget the extreme ends of that curve. Most of the Republicans, Democrats, and every other shade of gray in between will actually could be defined as a liberal internationalist of some stripe, essentially. That's the first thing. Second, I tell them every time is that the mourning of the downfall of the liberal internationalist values is so much simply because people in power today, or who are at the peak of their career, are those who came into their own or were in their formative years during the American unipolar moment in the 90s. Most of the professors who are teaching them about the catastrophe of tyranny that's going on today, or the decline of the liberal values, etc., came into their own. They were sort of maturing either in graduate school or in teenage or in some form of puberty or pre-puberty phase, when America had run out of peers and Hollywood had to pick on aliens to fight because there was no one else left to fight. And that, I mean, and so to that end, this is my standard critique, that, you have a crop of intellectuals today. Intellectuals is a very heavy word, but thinkers, members of the epistemic community, let me put it that way, which is largely NGOs, academia, etc., who are, let's say, most department chairs might be in their late 40s, early 50s, because, once you start reaching 60, 65, you don't want to deal with all that nonsense. And if you're lower than that, younger than that, you're probably too inexperienced to take on those roles. 35 years back, they were in graduate school. they were forming their views. Or there were others like, people like in our age group who were very young, and were sort of getting influenced by that unipolar moment. And unipolarity is so rare in world history. So now we are taking things that happened at a very rare moment in human history and pretending like that's going to be there forever, and bemoaning the fact that there is decline of values. The fact is, it's a decline of your framework. That's what's going on. Yes, there is violence. There's always been violence in the 90s too. Just go look at the record of
Right.
civil war, civil conflict in much of the world. You didn't get great power competition. Yes, you finally have that because China has risen. Uh, uh, but the point really is that, your experience, by your I mean all of our collective experience, those of us who know the 90s, late 80s onwards, if you're sentient and you kind of have a memory of that time frame, and especially if you were born and raised in the US, you grew up in a very peculiar time, which is unipolarity.
Right.
So the world doesn't owe you your unipolar moment.
Well,
And
what's
that's kind of what's
fascinating,
happening.
right? What's fascinating to me about it is there is still a very large subset of people, especially here in overrepresented in the educated classes here in the States. And I'm assuming in Europe too, but I don't know that much about Europe, so I'm not going to comment on that. Who fundamentally believe that the American narratives, from their unipolar moment, but also from their rise as a historical power, are applicable to various other contexts, Africa, South America, India. And what I've noticed is a lot of them are willing to back that belief up with money. And we have a series of oligarchs who've done it, in the early to mid 2000s. We had Bill Gates, and then George Soros and Pierre Omidyar, and there's a bunch of others who we can go into naming who most people wouldn't know about. But it's what's fascinating is that these people take their idea and try to shape the narrative inside India to reflect their understanding of India, right? Despite the fact that the locals want nothing to do with it. It's kind of like essentially a monopolization of the truth, that they know what the world is supposed to be like, and that everyone else should believe and accept these things. And I think two of the biggest areas where me and you saw it, Prashant, when we were in India, was in the security wing, right? This was when this was UPA 1, where the Naxal problem had essentially started to spiral out of control. And it was essentially, from essentially the Northeast running straight down all the way to Tamil Nadu, was called this Red Corridor. And they were trying to do something about it, but every time they tried to do something about it, some Western trained academic or some Westerner would come along and propose this series of theories as to why the Naxals are doing this, and it would cause the government to go into this whole tizzy of like self-recrimination analysis, and then they would not give the security forces permission to act. I think it was Prashant or something, one of the bigs in UPA. He actually came up with a theory as to why the Naxals were behaving the way they were, and then they tried to implement that through a series of NGOs, and it didn't resolve the problem, and in fact made it quite a bit worse because they realized that the Indian government wasn't going to retaliate as harshly. And then within like 2 years of the Modi government coming into power, of the NDA coming into power, suddenly the Red Corridor shrunk back down to a small sliver running between West Bengal and Odisha, right? And Chhattisgarh. So this is the kind of thing, and we've seen all the time with crime and violence, with law and order. that there's always this Western model that we're expected to follow, that we're expected to be the guinea pigs of, where the theories are all rolling out of Western universities.
One thing I'll just add before I let Ram and that come in is that P. Chidambaram actually started this Operation Green Hunt, and this was UPA 2, and this was after a very substantial, like a serious Naxal attack in Dantewada, where I think 79 CRPF Jawans were killed.
Yeah, I remember that.
And so he was ruthless. PC was extremely ruthless, and right. I mean, people were in the security community were largely correct, so not largely supporting that. So after that, once and in fact, someone that we both know, who I won't name here because I don't have their permission to take their name. Basically, said that PC was very clear to the CRPF top brass that look, I am not going to send the army to do this job. They were actually again someone who I won't name, who both you and I know, Varun, had recommended that a division of army included with armored column that was being demobilized from Kashmir be sent to take care of this business. And PC was very clear that you can't send the army with an armored column, which only trains to take on Pakistan and China into and to sort of tackle your own citizens. I mean, that's like the worst possible option. So then the CRPF was called in to say, look, you had this, you got your nose bloodied, figure it out. I don't care if you have another bloody nose. You can't be, and the reason for that massacre was actually they were not following protocols, standard operating procedures. They were using the same route to come back as they had gone in. And that's like, level 1 mistake. So essentially since 2010-11 onwards, you start to see this slow dwindling down of the Naxal problem. And it was largely propped up by, it's the fact that the state had a very light hand on the situation is what kept that going. There's no other laws of physics that actually would explain why that has to fester on for this long. It was a simple case of using security tools and also using some sort of co-option and sort of incentivizing sort of mainstreaming. But it was kind of festering on and on because of what had been happening historically.
And because of the amount of debate that was taking place in the upper echelons, like they weren't coming to a conclusion until Dantewada actually happened.
Yeah, and that was around the same time when Arundhati Roy famously said they're Gandhis with guns. So it was kind of feeding into this certain. Now, what will be interesting to analyze, I don't know if anyone can even prove this, is whether the insurgency was kept alive to feed a narrative. It's like tail wagging the dog almost. So because if the problem isn't there, what narrative are you going to peddle?
Right.
So anyway, now I'll stop and Ram and Advait can take over.
Yeah. I just want to take a step back and look at what Prashant said about what the United States sees in itself. One thing, what he said about the USA has it was established as an independent country in the late 1770s, and for the next 100 years or so, all they could focus on was basically consolidating the whole country with the civil war and the expansion westward and all that. And that was not a very peaceful time. It's not something some era that they recall proudly. It was a very chaotic and horrible time. It was only around the turn of the 20th century that they were able to consolidate everything as a whole country and power in one hand, and then they were able to tackle the external enemies and fight the two world wars, the Cold War and stuff. So if you look at India's timeline as an independent nation from the time we started to govern ourselves, it is just that we are at a different phase in our national life compared to the US. So that's where a lot of stuff which comes out, today, today USA is I mean, at least until the 1990s, America was, kind of unchallenged everywhere. At least within their own borders, they could impose their will in whichever way they wanted. So they could, they did not have a lot of reasons to use the force and, they can maintain a facade of, human rights and liberalism and independence and freedom of civil rights and everything within the country to a reasonable level. Of course, there were other things happening overseas, but those could be, safely kept out of sight and out of mind. But until the 2000s, India didn't have that luxury because we were still, consolidating that the national integrity. There were a lot of separatist movements, internal issues, border clashes, all that going on. So that's where I think a lot of this tussle comes between the Indian way of thought and the expectations from the United States and the West. Of course, when it comes to the when we say West, you also take into account the Western Europe. We have to remember in mind that after the post World War II, Western Europe was essentially under the American security umbrella. So which meant that whatever peace existed in the United States, Europe could also enjoy that without having to spend their own, political power or military power in securing that. So that's the atmosphere in which their own, ideas of liberalism and civil rights and all the other stuff which happened. Now their expectation is that India will also do that in the same manner, but did Europe or United States have the luxury of doing that when they were in 1800s? They did not. So that's where the mismatch comes. Yeah, that's where I see things stand. And another one is just like what happened in America, immediately after independence, the entire country split into two camps. One was the one which wanted more, independent way of doing things, more Americanized way of doing things. Develop more industry inside the United States, and kind of it was their own version of Atmanirbharta, which was the North, the in the Civil War. And then you had the South, which still wanted that mercantile way of doing things, exporting things to the England and the Europe, and just continuing on with the same way of life and all that. I think we had that same, I mean, not same, but similar kind of two camps splitting into in India also. I mean, the old way was that inherited the imperial mentality from the British. There has to be a central planning way of doing things. The government has to be, it has to be this haughty being that which is one step removed from the natural citizens. I mean, you still saw that kind of attitudes which persisted with the officer class, the military, and the bureaucracy. I mean, only recently it has all started to kind of change into something which is more in touch with the general public. And you actually, the one clear place you can see this in is in the judiciary. See, judiciary is the one which has undergone the least reforms from the time independence was acquired, because of the way the constitutional structure was made. They had the most independence. Ironically, they have the most independence, so they made sure that they still continued with the colonial mindset as far as possible.
Yeah.
So right now what we are having is we are having the transition period where there is a lot of discussions which is going on. There's a consolidation happening. And I think in another 20 or 30 years, we will have a totally different national character. But by that time, I don't know whether United States will have that, will still have that same attitudes, because we also see that changes are happening there also. There, we are, the pendulum is swinging back to the authoritarian modes of government. There are a lot of things which are the other way around.
Right.
So that will make for an interesting discussion.
No, that's definitely the case. Sorry, Rajat, did you want to jump in with anything here?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking. So what you just said, Varun, that we've kind of become a testing ground for Western academic theories, and it's like it's in literally every field. It's like, for example, you take economics. Okay, you had American Nobel Prize winners in economics. They pontificate to India, and our government just used to implement their theories completely. Now with the Modi government, they have their own mind. So maybe that's why Amartya Sen, like maybe that's part of the reason why people like whether it's Amartya Sen or Abhijit Banerjee and all, they are not so happy with the government for that reason, like part of the reason. And yeah, it's not just economics, even as Ram said, it's the the judiciary or whatever. We have become a testing ground. That's, I think, it's a reality. It's a sad reality. But hopefully now we are like moving away from that, and we are like, okay, we are not going to become the guinea pigs for your for all theories. You want to test them, do a computer simulation, but don't come to us. I think that's what the current government's attitude is. Because
Yeah, I
if you
would.
see economy also, like today there's like the government has this focus on Atmanirbhar Bharat. But actually, if you look at it historically, Atmanirbhar Bharat is just a continuation of Jawaharlal Nehru's policy of self-sufficiency. Like after just in the years just after independence, he set up a hell of a lot of PSUs to the idea was to make everything in-house, whether it's heavy equipment or whether it's consumer products or whatever. And that itself is taken from the older idea of Swadeshi. The Lal Bal Pal trio, Lala Lajpat Rai, Bipin Chandra Pal, and Pal Gangadhar Tilak, their idea of Swadeshi. So you're like, you're seeing a resistance to the Atmanirbhar Bharat, the manufacturing thing, in the form of people like Raghuram Rajan who are like, no, no, India should provide services and all that stuff. So it's like that.
So yeah, no, it's and you can see it cross sectorally. I'll give you guys an example, a couple of examples actually. One is from the LGBTQ community, right? Where up until this point, you've largely seen the community dominated by Western, educated or Western leaning, or Western influenced leadership, to the point where they started classifying openly Hindu LGBTQ people as homo nationalists. They come up with this really cringe term to describe them. And it was bad enough at a certain point, especially when I was in India, where I managed to talk to a few people from the community, where they essentially said that if you even mentioned, being Hindu or being a practicing Hindu, you would lose access to healthcare, to educational opportunities, to job opportunities, to various other forms of security, because the leadership was that vicious in trying to cut out people who they perceived as not ideologically aligned fully. And that means, being not Hindu, rejecting Hinduism in its entirety. That started to change recently, with more organizations coming out as openly Hindu and supporting Hindu LGBTQ members, as well as other LGBTQ people in the country. And a lot of the sampradayas also have openly said, the reformist ones especially, have openly said, no, we'll support you, because we have nothing against your how you were born. It's that conflict has reached a zenith, has kind of reached or is reaching, I should say, a critical juncture, especially with this whole Israel-Palestine conflict, where during the Pride last month, you had a lot of the Pride rallies be very small, because a lot of people who are LGBTQ said, no, we don't want to have our moment in the sun, or the point where we're advocating for our issues, to get entangled with other political issues that are important in the West. We don't have that kind of material luxury where, we can actually go and allow other groups to piggyback on our push for rights and our push for economic security and physical security. So there's been kind of a schism, and it's gonna continue to grow, where the westernized LGBTQ people are going to be slowly pushed out, and a more Indic, more Bharatian version of that movement will kind of take root and start to grow. The other place I would say it's been a big one, and Prashant, obviously, like this was 10 years ago. I remember a particular presentation that we both had to sit through, where it was talking about border security and immigration issues. And the person who was giving the presentation, again, no names mentioned, had essentially taken the material from the US border security discussions and the US-Mexico border, copy pasted it without changing a damn thing, and essentially presented it as a viable option for India too. And the US was all like very high tech, use of drones, CCTV cameras, all of this very high tech, motion detectors, all of this. And so it was a 1 hour long presentation, and at the end of it, there's a question and answer session. And so it was one of the retired colonels or one of the retired brigadiers raised their hand during the question and answer session and basically asked, what is this going to cost us? And it ended the discussion right there. Like the entire discussion terminated. But that's the kind of thing you're starting to see where there's been a pushback on across sectors to deal with this. And financially, even the Soros network and the Omidyar networks have this year announced they're going to be pulling back funds because they're not getting with the whole information warfare thing, because they weren't getting returns on it. So they pulled support and a lot of but there's still a lot of money coming in, especially through NGOs and universities, where Western governments essentially this international capital flow essentially flows in to alter and modify and influence how India does things.
That bit about the border stuff is really funny, because the US border and the Indian border, at least the part you need to defend, are completely opposite. The United States is a completely desertified border, at least with the southern border. Yeah, for India, it's all Himalayas, snow-capped mountains, and of course you have the Rajasthan border, which is a desert, but that's only a very small part.
But the Bangladeshi border is all riverlands and wetlands, so
Yeah,
Yeah,
swampy.
yeah, it's swampy, and you need to have completely different way of thinking about how to monitor and defend those kinds of borders. Yeah, I mean, in the same vein, I think I think it's a whole consequence of how successful and how powerful that United States has become. See, when what you have is success after success, and keep gaining wealth, you kind of start into a mode of thinking that the only right way to do things is the way that I do. You cannot escape that trap. So you kind of you almost acquire a messianic zeal to preach that to anybody who's willing to listen. That's what has happened a lot, in terms of democracy, trying to bring democracy to the Middle East, where the entire political and social structure is completely different. And in Africa, where even today a lot of things are all driven by tribal loyalties. I think as far
sorry,
as
my
India is
cat wants to
concerned,
contribute too. So
yeah, she's doing a wonderful job. Is that a she or a he?
he.
He, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was the other thing I was? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, I'll come back later.
You were talking about Africa and the tribal affinities.
Yeah, I think the one reason that Americans are especially worried about India is that there's first of all there is a lot of affinity because of the English speaking language, the large diaspora, and the democracy part and everything. So it's too close. At least for another country, you can pretend that okay, they speak another language, they have some other kind of political system. Okay, so they're in their own world. But anything that India does differently, it registers with it occupies a large part of that mental canvas because there are so many similarities that the differences stand out particularly very high. I think that's why a lot of mind space and column inches and internet
You
space is
know,
spent on criticizing what India does and what India should be doing and why this is not right, this is not wrong.
so one of the things I've actually noticed there, and it has a lot to do with sorry, it had a lot to do with the financial flows from the US to India, right? A lot of those columns are actually written by Indians, diaspora Indians, and a lot of those people who do write it are in some way affiliated with the opposite, the old guard, right? The Lutyens crowd and whatnot. And what I noticed, especially when I was in India, is that those NGOs, those grants, those scholarly grants, those university programs were a ladder essentially for the lower ranks of these Latvian scouts to gain some kind of recognition and some kind of foothold in the Indian hierarchy, but also in the US. And as a result, there was quite a bit of financial flow from the Western world, not just the US, because England participated in this too, and I believe that continental Europe did. These financial flows supported a lot of very lavish lifestyles in India. I remember NGO people from NGO human rights organizations coming by, and they would be like living and staying in like 5-star hotels and leading pretty luxurious lives compared to what the average government, even high-ranking government official was used to. I think that played a very big part in how this whole insistence on narrative setting, this whole insistence on letting India be kind of a petri dish for Western theories, because a lot of people made a lot of money and continue to make a lot of money off of it. But increasingly, the tap is being shut off on one side,
Yeah, that's very interesting. There are two aspects to it. One is the whole the dynamics of that whole relationship. Everybody gets a payoff there. One is the people, the Indian people who go and talk in the same language as the Western um, scholars. They get the payoff of recognition. The sponsors, the people who sponsor them, they also get a payoff because they have a conduit to the Indian community now, a brown conduit, okay, rather than a white man and white person coming and telling them, the American coming and telling them, they have an Indian, half Indian, half American conduit, who is more palatable to the Indian side. This is one part. The other one is, this is a very long-standing tradition of sucking up to the people in power. Okay, I think Prashant alluded to the whole Mahatma Gandhi's earlier attitudes towards the South Africans. Because in the late 1800s, after the East India rule ended and the empire was firmly established, the whole attitude of a lot of educated Indian was that, okay, the British Raj is the one which is going to endure. There's no point in fighting it. Better we work out ways of having a harmonious relationship with them. I mean, the whole Indian National Congress was born with that thought. I mean, it was a British man who founded it, and a lot of anglicized Indian, elites when they're. I mean, the whole, going to England and getting a barrister. It was, and the whole moderates versus extremist conflict within the Indian National Congress that happened in the 1910s and 1920s. The moderates wanted to have good relations with the British and eventually get some kind of uh, somewhat quasi self rule kind of thing. Uh, and then the extremists kind of took over and said that no, nothing, Swaraj, it's Swaraj or nothing. That's it, Swaraj or bust. They kind of took an extremist position and all that. It's kind of that we have that. I mean, societies have that. Some sections of societies have that. They naturally gravitate towards that kind of establishing that kind of relationships with whoever is the most powerful one. I think they just continued that kind of dynamics with the Americans also.
Yeah.
One thing I want to just before Varun, just
Go ahead.
I think just to sort of provide more detail to what you already said, you and Ram both said. Uh, it was natural for essentially when you say Latins, like not everyone watching this might understand what that phrase means, but I'll just sort of summarize that, having grown up around them, because my all my life I was not part of Latins, but I saw it from very close quarters. Because we were we belonged to a family that had people working in the government, so you live in government quarters, which is largely which largely is in these areas. That's where they are. These are mostly post-colonial elites. Now, that's essentially a phrase that anyone watching this will understand, like African, Southeast Asian, it doesn't matter who you are, South American. You understand the phrase post-colonial elites. These are the people who largely were collaborating, working with the British, managing the empire for them, who learned the English language, which became sort of the ticket out of the lower middle class into the upper classes. It gave them access to foreign education. And they sort of, because they were the ones who had the experience running the government, they became part of the government, essentially, and therefore the elite. So hence the word post-colonial, post-colonial elite. So, and what happens then is that you suddenly have uh, the politics changing, not just between the 50s to about the 70s, but with the Mandal Commission in the late 80s, early 90s, you have like this whole proletariatization of the civil services and the politicians. And on top of that, you have the Ayodhya movement in the starting the late 80s and into the early 90s. And now you have a Hinduization of the politics. So they have successively lost the civil services. They have successively lost the political space. They're losing corporate space as well. In fact, every time you hear people talking about, oh, the Indian education system should be more holistic, there should be more emphasis put on grooming and how being more polished, that's instantly taken down on social media, trolled on social media by saying you're essentially trying to like parachute people who are not necessarily good at competitive exams, because that is really a fair playing field. You either know how to do a sum or you don't know how to do it. You either know how to balance a chemistry equation or you don't know how to do it. I don't need to be the grandson of the former cabinet secretary to to, or that doesn't matter here. So these competitive exams were actually the levelers. So whenever someone says that this should not be the only criteria, it is seen as a mark of, a very sophisticated expression of entitlement. Uh, Last point I'll say is that these are the people who have now gone to sort of who get admissions to your top flight humanities programs in half a dozen or a dozen universities in the US and UK. They are the ones who have essentially are gatekeepers to written print media and to some extent published work as well. Now,
Yeah.
not all of them are from uber elite classes. Some of them are from the middle classes, lower middle classes, who have gotten a PhD, have worked very hard, have ingratiated themselves into the system of gatekeeping. And this is the last line of defense that's left for them. They've lost the civil services, they've lost politics, they've lost corporate India, they have lost public services. Nobody works in these places. Go look at the people who are working in these places. There was a time in the 90s when you wanted to go get foreign exchange, you could speak in English and get the job done. Today, you can't. They'll speak, if they know you can't speak in Hindi, they'll speak to you in whatever crooked English they have, and they're okay with it. Nobody cares. English print and mainstream, lack of a better word, mainstream media, that's where you see their faces, and that's their last line of defense that's left, that so-called civil society and media.
Yep.
Once this goes, that's it. And if you look at the Ram Temple debate that's going on, you suddenly have journalists like Karan Thapar talking to the Shankaracharya. I mean, in which alternate universe would I have ever imagined Karan talking to Shankaracharya? Right? There's
Yeah.
no context. So suddenly you have atheists trying to figure out the muhurtam, why Pushyamasam is not supposed to be quote unquote good for a muhurt, for prana pratisthapana. Maybe it is good for prana pratisthapana. I mean, atheists, like card carrying atheists, what anyone would sort of describe as deracinated left atheists are now interested in how muhurtam is calculated. And they're essentially they're like spectators in a tennis match watching, the conservative Hindus of different types just arguing or debating each other on whether it's the right way to do it or the wrong way to do it. Are the shastras, agamas being followed or not being followed? And they have nothing to say for once, other than make some clever by half comment here and there. They've got, so they are realizing in the Ram temple, and this is the last thing I'll say in this with this Ram temple episode. I think the idea is dawning on them that maybe we are completely irrelevant to current society, and these people are not, going to be standing for election in Piccadilly in London, or Saks Avenue here in New York. So this is the problem. So they're very loud because that's the last final frontier that's left. The day you have centrists, I'm not even talking about right wing, I mean centrists like myself, who are largely, we are a micro minority in the social sciences, humanities spaces. If we were to start getting more and more foothold, which we slowly are, it's a very slow and painful process. It's going to be a lifetime. I'm telling you now, it's going to take a generation, and we have to be okay with it. That's it. You don't even have to dominate it. You just need to be 20%, 30% of the crowd. That's all you need. So this is the final frontier, the media narrative. So I always tell my students, if you're reading something about India on any news outlet, make sure that you understand that if you're really interested, don't read it. Do your own primary research. But if you have a nodding interest, remember that what gets published in a particular outlet on your own local politics. Do you agree with everything that particular outlet says about American politics? If no, then be rest assured that there is a slant in even whatever you're reading about China or India or any other place, or Timbuktu or wherever it is. So always have a certain disbelief when you're reading things about places that are too far away and very different from where you are from. So that is eroding. That space will eventually erode. It has to erode because you can't be gatekeepers, keep debate out, people who disagree with you out completely, and get away with it. These people have had it too good for too long, and that has to change.
Yeah. Ram, you had something you want to jump in?
Well, I mean, it's been an interesting discussion. I think we've had spoken about for 45 minutes or 50 minutes. So let's, shall we just make some concluding remarks and wrap it up?
Sure. Yeah. I think I've pretty much covered everything I want to. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you guys. This is where things are right now, is that you're seeing a breakdown in the narrative domination that the post-colonial elite had and the West had through the post-colonial elite of India. I don't know if it's happening in other places. I know it's already happened in China, but I don't know if it's happening in other places in the world. And increasingly, you will see more Indic, more Bharatian, culturally entrenched organizations start to rise. The NGOs, I would say that the NGOs are already well on their way to change, because most of them can't get funding anymore without coming under intense government scrutiny. So as time goes on now, we're going to see an increasing divide. And the diaspora community actually here in the States and in Europe as well is going to have to learn how to fend for itself and how to translate a lot of the material that's coming out of India, because over the last year, especially here in the States, we've seen an increasing number of attacks directed at the diaspora community because the attackers can't reach India anymore. They cannot hit Modi anymore. They cannot hit the BJP anymore. They cannot hit the RSS anymore. So they're starting to target the diaspora community. And this is increasingly causing the diaspora community to start waking up and being more proactive in its own defense. So within the next couple of years here, next 5 years, 3 to 5 years, I expect the diaspora community to become much more politically active and much more politically savvy in order to help influence the narrative and to shape the narrative so it isn't quite as dangerous for Indians living, Hindus and Indians living in the US.
To add to what you guys said, especially what Prashant said about the, let's just call them the idea of India crowd. They've successively been losing out on one space after the other. So as he said, they lost the civil services, they lost politics and so on. But there's one area which is completely still under left domination, and that's the environmental space. And which is sad because environmentalism should have actually been a conservative talking point. It's like we should have been dominating that area, but our side just abandoned it because of the free market hoopla, and we let the whole discourse of environmentalism be hijacked by the left. So that is one area where they are still very much dominant. Like all the influential discourse that happens in the environmental space is done by them. So I think that also, hopefully it will change with time, but yeah, it's like the problem is like when we talk about environment, okay, the four of us, we are pro-environment, but we are, on the Hindutva side. But how many people are there like us as a percentage? Because the average Hindutva person, he or she will reflexively associate environmentalism with leftism. And I can't entirely blame them. But that's the thing, right? We have to reclaim the environmental discourse also. Yeah.
Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, two thoughts. About the dynamics that's going to happen in United States with respect to diaspora. Yeah, I think the key issue is going on here is the whole mechanism of integration in the United States is kind of breaking down. The whole melting pot mechanism, which was very successful in the earlier 20th century, it is kind of breaking down partly because of the identity politics, which has replaced the whole everyone gets into the whole melting pot and kind of sheds their national identities and becomes one as American. So not just diaspora, but other people of other backgrounds, racial backgrounds are also going to have kind of a tumultuous time in the coming decade. But that can wait for of course, the whole India USA dynamics which is going on will only add to that tension. But that requires a whole other discussion. And the other one, what Rajat said about the environmentalism is that there are two things at play here. One is, I think the Indic side has a decent track record on environmentalism. We don't need a whole other crop of environmentalists to come and badger us into doing something. Because we haven't gone whole hog into free market capitalism. We still have a environmental aspect, even though it's not expressed explicitly. Okay, we hold placards for environment, we do festivals and other stuff. So I think we'll do okay, but the debate will happen on its own time within the terms defined by us, not dictated by somebody else from outside India. So I don't think we need to worry about that too much at this time. It will happen on its own. And again, summing up all together what we discussed today, I think one thing I think we all agreed upon is that there was a lot of influence from the West because of the political dynamics which was in play on their end and in the Indian end. But now that the dynamics is changing in both sides, we are less and less, looking up to them and more looking inwards and setting our own terms. And that process is almost nearly complete, like Prashant pointed out. So what needs to be seen is that how do we progress from here? Because I think for all for all appearances, India is going to become a self-contained society from now on. It's barring a few exceptions, we are going to be culturally influenced by the happenings within our own country from this point onwards. So it should be interesting to see how it's going to progress from here, and whether we can foresee any trends that are going to happen. That should probably have happen in another discussion.
No, I'll end with end my comments with a last point and an anecdote from my recent India visit. One is, Rajat, you were mentioning Hindutva crowd. There's a lot of confusion on the left of center or the liberal internationalism and what that really means. They usually think of RSS the moment we say Hindutva, they hear the word Hindutva. The fact is that the most dominant voices and the proactive people on the ground are not the RSS people. These are small organizations, people who are overcoming the collective action problem, organizing, who are uh, who have their own businesses. Their cash flow doesn't come from being NGO workers or activists. Their money doesn't come from activism. Then that's something they do it out out of passion. They already have established. A lot of them are in different sort of money generating businesses. I won't tell them because I don't want people to start putting two and two together and figuring out who people might be. But so that's number one. So, and a lot of them are very critical of the RSS. They basically say that they're the paper tigers, basically. Right. So, and they're not necessarily in tune with RSS's vision of what being culturally rooted in Bharat means. I mean, when we use the term Hindutva, usually that's exactly what a lot of people want to hear. They're like, there you have it. These are Sanghis. They are like from RSS. No, none of most of the people, a lot of people, most people think that are from actually RSS or from VHP, etc. Have nothing to do with. They have no leverage in these institutions, and these institutions are largely now what we call establishment institutions who are just happy being in power. That's the concern. That's what this gentleman told me when I was meeting with him. That what are they doing? They are now in power. They are the dominant force now. They're happy being that, and they're doing they're doing their iftar parties. They're doing all that. They're becoming like the Congress of the 60s, essentially. That is what I heard. Direct quote: Congress of the 60s, before the purge and all happened, early 60s Congress. So they're becoming like that. They're very moderate. When have you seen what show of strength have you seen? Muscular show, like what are people really scared of? Why are you scared of the RSS? Not by you, I mean, this guy was asking of posing a rhetorical question to the liberals and the leftists, etc. What exactly have they done that you're so scared? And the things that have happened, the violence that has happened, have nothing to do with the RSS. These are other groups that have sort of vigilante groups or whoever they are. So I think so. That's what is confusing a lot of people in the global capitals of the world, that they think that the moment you say Hindutva or the right wing movement in India, they think of the RSS because that's what they've been told for decades, that these are the people. And it has still not dawned on them that it's not them. It's a whole other ecosystem that's mushrooming, largely by people who are super motivated and overcoming the collective action problem. So that's kind of my last take, because this guy who I met, who's really sort of who cares a lot about a lot of these topics, he routinely bashes the Sangh and the RSS on their social media platforms, and has no goodwill left in that organization to that extent, right? So I'll leave it at that, because it's a fairly diverse movement, and we can discuss a lot on that at some other point.
Great. Yeah, this was a really good discussion, and I feel we've opened up the doors to several other topics that we can pursue in the future. To any of you guys watching this, if you enjoyed the content, obviously like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any comments and questions, leave it in the comment section below. Okay, I guess we can wrap it up from there.
Let's pause the record, stop the record.